Salutations, gentle viewers. This is George from Ireland. In this video, I shall be continuing my series about the Rudolf Hess mystery. Just to remind you, Rudolf Hess was the Deputy Führer of the Third Reich. That's Germany. So he was involved in Nazism from the earliest days. He was involved in countless crimes. He was complicit in the Night of the Long Knives, when over 300 people were killed without trial, murdered therefore. He signed the Nuremberg laws. These were anti-Jewish discriminatory laws and so forth. And in May 1940, the 10th of that month, he flew to the United Kingdom with the purpose of meeting the Duke of Hamilton. And Hess had somehow got it into his head that this aristocrat was one of the most important people in the United Kingdom. Dukes were not that important by the 1940s. A cabinet minister would have mattered more. The Duke was a conservative, like most men who were cut from his social cloth, but he was not especially political. Remember, as a Duke, he was automatically part of the House of Lords. That's the upper chamber of the British Parliament. The Duke of Hamilton had been a member of the Anglo-German Friendship League. Now, this organisation, to some extent, was devoted to the entirely laudable goal of promoting amity between Germany and the United Kingdom. We should try and promote brotherhood worldwide and try to avoid the risk of war. At worst, these people were a Nazi ginger group. Well, they fellow travels with National Socialism. The Duke of Hamilton was known to be amenable to negotiation. In 1940, he published a letter in the Times newspaper, that was the UK's most prominent establishment newspaper, expressing the deeply unfashionable view that the United Kingdom ought to open negotiations with the Third Reich with a view to ending the war, but only if certain conditions were met. He made it contingent on better treatment for the Jewish minority in Germany, when plenty of people had said, not our problem, or some people would be even anti-Semitic and actually approve of the mistreatment of the German Jewish community. The Duke of Hamilton was on duty commanding RAF Turnhouse, that's now Edinburgh Airport. He was a serving officer of the Royal Air Force. The Duke of Kent happened to be in the same area. The Duke of Kent was the youngest brother of King George VI. Remember, Edward VIII had abdicated in December 1936, supposedly over his desire to marry the twice divorced Mrs. Wallis Simpson. But people say there was an ulterior explanation, in fact, because Edward VIII was pro-Nazi. Some people thought the Duke of Kent ought to have taken over as king, not George VI. Not go by primogeniture, because the Duke of Kent, well, he looked the part. He was 6'4", he had dashing good looks, he was genial, he was eloquent, he was every inch prince, unlike his brother, George VI, who was afflicted with a speech impediment. You may have seen the King's Speech. So the Duke of Kent had a predilection which was not en vogue at the time. He was a cross-dresser. And this is the sort of eccentricity that people did not indulge very easily in those days. He was once arrested in Soho, that's London's red light district, dressed as a woman. When the police established that this really was the Duke of Kent, as in a prince, they immediately let him go. The Duke of Kent, he was married to Princess Marina of Yugoslavia, and the Duke was particularly concerned about continental affairs. And people even mooted the idea he should be King of Poland after the war. Remember, Poland had elected kings until the end of the 18th century. And Poland was a republic, 1918 to 1939. It was obviously a Polish government in exile, but some Polish traditionalists would like to bring back an elected monarchy, often electing someone who was a prince, a younger prince in the family from another established royal household. Anyhow, Rudolf Hess expressed his earnest wish to parley with His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent. The British public were always told that His Majesty's government never entertained the idea of talking to Axis governments. However, there were some in the British political elite who were not so sanguine about the UK's chances of triumph, and they thought perhaps we ought to extend the olive branch to the Third Reich. Don't have to be defeated, call it a draw. Maybe we do. Maybe we are going to be defeated. Wouldn't it be better to make peace now, give away something, rather than be completely annihilated? The outlook for the United Kingdom was grim indeed. As Churchill later said, before El Alamein, never a victory, after El Alamein, never a defeat, which simplifies it only a little. Remember, the Battle of El Alamein was November 1942. So there were not much grounds for optimism in May 1941. Remember, France was under the Nazi heel. The Soviet Union was still at peace with the Third Reich, and indeed was the breadbasket of the Third Reich, providing everything the Third Reich wanted for a price. So the Blitz, that was these Luftwaffe bombing raids of the United Kingdom, were exacting a toll. Fortunately for the United Kingdom, the Luftwaffe, that's the German Air Force, was not concentrating particularly on munitions factories and airfields and so forth. The Baedeker raids, as in Baedeker was a guidebook saying, if you go to this city, you must see that art gallery. If you go to that city, you must look at this castle. So hitting targets of cultural import. And Adolf Hitler miscalculated, thinking this would really demoralize the British populace, which is why, for instance, the National Gallery in London had its treasures taken out of it, and they were hidden down a coal mine in the westernmost part of the United Kingdom, so that if that building took a direct hit, these objets d'art would not go up in flames. After the war, many people claimed that they were very ebullient and their will to fight never wavered. However, the truth isn't quite like that. It's borne out by things like mass observation. The British government was keeping tabs on conversations were overheard. What do people really think? And people were not quite so gung-ho as the propaganda would have us believe. Some people fell for that after the war. Some people remembered things more rosily than they'd felt at the time. So Hitler was later given a truth serum. He was also diagnosed, Hess, as being mentally ill. That was kept quiet at the time because under the Geneva Convention, if he'd lost his reason, then he would have to be released on humanitarian grounds. Astonishingly, the United Kingdom did not make much of this propaganda coup that Rudolf Hess had fallen into their hands. Why? Maybe it was something embarrassing. Maybe the reason he came is because he was invited. Was he invited by Churchill? Probably not. Was he invited by somebody else in the cabinet, someone in this top circle? Quite likely. By the Duke of Kent? Maybe. By the Duke of Hamilton? Perhaps. But anyway, he was treated with incredible leniency. He was even allowed out on parole to take exercise, walk around unsupervised. It's staggering in the midst of this life and death conflict. He had to sign an agreement saying, I promise not to escape whilst doing this, nor to make preparations for any future escape, nor commit any act which would be prejudicial to the United Kingdom or her allies. Anyway, the Deputy Führer, he honoured this. He went around unescorted. But perhaps he was so convinced that the Third Reich was going to win, there was no need to run away. Or was he frightened of going back to the Third Reich, thinking something would happen to him? So Rudolf Hess, he was kept prisoner for the rest of his life, from 1941 to the day he died in 1987. It's very close to the 31st anniversary of his death, and it's one of the first news items I remember in my life, hearing that Hess had died. So he served 46 years in prison. He was the longest serving British prisoner at the time. He spent the last 30 years of his life or so in Germany. So he was in the United Kingdom, the Tower of London briefly. He was later transferred. He was there at the Nuremberg war crimes trial, where he was lucky to escape the noose, and then he was committed to Spandau prison in Berlin. So the Allies were discussing his release at the time he died. But some people cast doubt on the notion that the man in Spandau prison was indeed Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was wounded in the chest in the First World War whilst fighting in Romania. The medical records of this, and the man in Spandau prison had no such wound. People say these wounds can shrink and shrink and shrink and then just disappear over the decades. So at the Nuremberg trial, he appeared to be confused, out of sorts. Yet, in moments of lucidity, he would vow that he was not remotely penitent, and he would vow his lifelong fidelity to the Nazi cause. Anyway, there were some doubts about the identity of the prisoner who was on trial at the Nuremberg trial. However, the Hess family unanimously and without wavering said that this man is most certainly our relative. So why would anyone agree to play the role of Hess? Would this man be paid? Well, he certainly wasn't enjoying it when he was serving life imprisonment. He kind of spent his filthy lucre. So who could be brainwashed into believing they really were Hess? There are other reasons to think that he was indeed Hess. It makes no sense. Some people say, Hess was killed on a capture in 1941. Dr. Thomas says that. It seems to be nonsense. Other people say that Hess was murdered in 1987 rather than committing suicide in that garden shed by hanging. The British did not want him released. That's a theory. The SAS bumped him off. Why had Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister at the time, then agreed to his release. Anyway, if the inmate of Spandau was not Rudolf Hess, he wouldn't have any secrets, so there'd be no point in killing him. Anyway, the final prisoner in Spandau was Rudolf Hess. This has been established by voice recognition technology, listening to a clip of Hess speaking in 1937 at Nuremberg rally, and then to his trial in 1946, and also almost exactly the same register, quite a high-pitched voice. There are many family photos of him, and you can see his face at the same many anatomical points, which don't change over the decades. And as the guards testified, the man in Spandau prison cared deeply about his son and other relatives. So if this man in Spandau had embarrassing information to reveal about the UK, he could have disclosed it at any point. So he had countless visits from his family. The Soviets would have been very eager to obtain information on him which would reflect his credit in the United Kingdom. So go back to 1941. Getting Hess to come to the United Kingdom was a good way of making the Reich look very foolish indeed. He could have been tortured into revealing secret information. Oh, but torture's un-British. Well, come on, every nationality's done it, and that includes the UK. All right, not very much, sometimes not very severely, but this was mortal struggle. So if people were ever going to bend rules past breaking point, this was the moment. He could prove useful to the British Empire in that sense. He could unsettle the Germans. It could be presented as a defection. He could be forced to reveal military secrets. He could be made under duress to make anti-Nazi broadcasts to Germany, but none of that was done. So when he eventually went to prison in Germany after the Second World War, the prison was governed by rotation by the four Allied occupying powers: Americans, British, French, and Soviet. Each of them had the prison for a month. The Soviets liked this because the prison was in West Berlin, as in the non-communist zone. But at the end of his life, he was the most expensive prisoner in the world. So that's a sort of overview of the Hess mystery. But there's another aspect to it, which I'll come on to in a moment, about the Duke of Kent.